Good evening, everyone. This presentation is being recorded. If anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, you can raise your hand and or put your question or comment in the chat. We thank you for being here tonight for New Hampshire Legislative Process 101. This presentation will be available on CSNI's website, as well as CSNI's YouTube channel and social media. So why don't we start off with introductions, Jen?
Hi there, my name is Jennifer Bertrand, and I am the Director of Community Partnerships at Community Crossroads, one of the 10 area agencies that serve individuals with developmental and other disabilities. I coordinate our agency's public policy, development activities, and marketing activities. I am also a parent of a now adult daughter who experiences a significant developmental disability and is served by another area agency here in New Hampshire.
Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Blake, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for CSNI, Community Support Network Incorporated. CSNI is the association of the 10 area agencies. I'm also a parent of a child who experiences a disability, and he may pop in at any point. Advocacy has become my passion, and hopefully we'll go through this process, with speed and with making it as interesting as possible. Because I don't know about Jen, but I love this stuff, and it's just amazing to me how much access that individuals have with the legislative process here in New Hampshire.
Knowledge is power. And as a parent, you know that you're not going to live forever. And as a mom, I lay awake at night and I worry about, what will the future bring? And that's why I've worked so hard to develop and mentor other parent and individual advocates so that we can work together to craft a better future for people with developmental and other disabilities.
All right. Okay, so to jump right in, New Hampshire has a government system that has 3 branches of government, like the federal government. We have the executive branch, which includes the governor, the executive council, and commissioners. We'll talk more about them in a minute. We have the legislature, which is the New Hampshire House and the New Hampshire Senate. And we have the judicial branch, which is the New Hampshire State Supreme Court, Superior Court, Circuit Court, and drug and mental health courts.
The first branch of government that we're going to cover tonight is what we consider the executive branch, and that's inclusive of the governor, executive council, and commissioners. Let's take a closer look at what those are. Let's start with the governor. Recently, Governor Sununu won re-election, and governors in New Hampshire serve 2-year terms. He was a former CEO of Waterville Valley Resort. He also is a former executive counselor and proud dad. And his name, Sununu, is very well known in the state because he's the son of a former New Hampshire governor and a brother who was a former U.S. senator. He's married to his wife, Valerie, and she's a former special education teacher as well. Next up, here's a slide that shows you a picture of what you would see if you happen to visit Concord, or our State House in Concord, our capital city here in New Hampshire. The photograph on the left is from the very front of the building and the front steps. We actually, our State House is the oldest where our legislative body still does its business or occupies its original chambers. In the upper right-hand corner is what you would see if you stepped in through those doors and you looked around. There's the Hall of Flags. That is the front lobby of the building. This is the People's State House. So it is open to the public. Now that we don't have, the type of COVID restrictions that we did see back in 2020 and some point in 2021, things are slowly getting back to normal. In the bottom right-hand corner is another picture of one of the hallways on the main floor when you're in the State House. I think this photograph was actually taken when Maggie Hassan was still serving as governor. And I'm sure Karen will be following up with an email of tonight's presentation, and you'll notice that there's a link at the bottom of the slide. Maybe you don't have a lot of time or traveling to Concord is a very long drive for you. You can go to that link at the bottom of this slide and you can take a virtual tour of the State House to become more familiar. We have a budget session coming up, this legislative session, and it'll be important for families to share their stories and to advocate and to let our elected lawmakers know that, you know, we want them to fully support funding for developmental services. So this might be a great way to get a little more comfortable and know what things will look like when you do have a chance to visit in the future.
So interesting fun fact. So again, remember, I love all of this stuff. Does anyone else know why New Hampshire has a gold dome on its State House? Anybody know?
I do.
Okay, Kenda,
Hey,
why do we have a gold dome?
okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Why do we have a gold dome?
We have a gold dome because we had a president of the United States who came from New Hampshire.
That is 100% correct. Thank
My
you.
husband is very proud of me now.
Thank you, Kenda. Yes, states that have had a U.S. president are the only ones that can have a gold dome on their State House. Just a fun little fact.
So obviously the governor's office is located here in the New Hampshire State House, and that's why I sort of led with a picture of the State House. Not only is it an important place where you might have the opportunity to go and talk with legislators or publicly testify at a hearing. So let's talk a little bit more about the Executive Council. Next slide. So the Executive Council is a body that helps to make up the executive branch. This Executive Council that I think New Hampshire is the only state that has an executive council, and it's a throwback to the colonial days. And after this most recent election, we didn't see a change up here. So you can see who's currently representing the 5 different districts. So the state is divided into 5 districts. There are 5 councilors, and the governor also sits on the executive council. They're very important because they approve a major portion of the dollars that are appropriated to the legislator, like all of the contracts. And the executive council, like I mentioned, is a throwback to the colonial days, and it was intended to limit the power of the governor. Remember when we founded this country, folks were very leery of having any kind of colonial rule. And they wanted to make sure that, as a governor of the state, that person didn't have too much power that would, lead us back to those times. They are considered the watchdogs of the Treasury, and they also approve appointments for like commissioners, judges, and they also hear pardon requests. So this is a very powerful entity within our state government. And anytime we're doing legislative policy advocacy where, a contract needs to be approved, this is a body that you might have an opportunity to go and visit and, observe a meeting and or reach out and contact your counselors and ask them to either support or oppose a contract based on, what the issue is of the time. Next slide. And here's some photographs from inside of the executive chamber. This is located on the 2nd floor of the State House. And you can see the big ornate wooden table and chair set. They sit around this chair. I mean, they're still operating old school here. There's no streaming the meetings on the internet. They have like an actual tape recorder that they record their meetings on. So if you want to currently know what's happening during their meetings, you would actually have to go to the State House and sit. They usually have chairs set up near those back doors where that big opening is to at the back of the room in the top right-hand photograph. Yeah, and on the other side of that big doorway is actually the where the governor's office is. There's a desk there. The door's in the way back in that photograph, which it's a little bit hard to make out, not the bottom one, but the top right. Those are the doors that you enter through to go into the actual governor's office.
Mhm.
So a very important body. And these folks, our executive counselors, are important people to get to know and develop relationships with.
And interesting about the executive council, they meet year round. So unlike the legislature, that's generally from January to June, the executive council meets, I believe, is it every 2 weeks, Jen? Minimally monthly.
Yeah, I would have to look. I'm not sure what their schedule is. They do meet regularly. And I think, obviously if there's a pressing issue, they can also call an emergency meeting. So the commissioners are appointed by the executive council, and the current commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services, only for another week this month, is Lori Shibinette. She's been serving since December 2019. I mean, boy, did she have a lot to manage as the pandemic hit. It must have been a very challenging time. Months ago, she did communicate that she would be stepping down from her position in mid-December, and Lori Weaver has been nominated as her interim replacement. The commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services also, is the head of the State Department. The Bureau of Developmental Services is housed within DHHS, this individual plays an important leadership role in guiding and structuring the service delivery system that impact our families for the developmental service system. So we have some facts about Lori Shibinette here. I'll have to do some more research and learn a little bit more about Lori Weaver. She has been serving as like the right-hand person of Lori Shibinette, but she's, been sort of under the radar until now. So I have some homework to do, and I'm looking forward to meeting her and starting a relationship.
As do I. Interesting, last Thursday, the executive council actually had a public hearing on Lori Weaver's nomination, as well as I believe it's the proposed commissioner of agriculture. So again, like Jen was saying, the only thing you can do now is look at news reports from last Thursday, which was December 1st, or go on to the executive council website and listen to the recording.
They do have it available on the website, Karen? Wow.
I'm not sure yet. I haven't looked yet.
But they typically post them at some point after a meeting.
They do.
Okay. That's good to know. See, I learn something new every day. Next slide. So another important commissioner, if you're a parent of a child with a developmental or other disability, is the Commissioner of Education. And Frank Edelblut, who was a former state House representative, he is the father of 7 children and 6 grandchildren. His professional experience is mainly around working in the accounting field. He's a certified public accountant. He was chief financial officer, business owner, investor. And obviously he plays an important leadership role in terms of public education in New Hampshire. So this would be another important person if you really care about doing some advocacy and public policy around education, public education, then he is definitely someone that you'll want to reach out to and meet and start developing a relationship with. Next slide is you, Karen.
Why don't we take a quick pause here? Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts on the executive branch? You can raise your hand or write in the chat. Hearing none, we'll continue on. So next up is the legislative branch, and that is comprised of the New Hampshire House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Our New Hampshire legislature has 400 House representatives, 24 senators. They also have 2-year terms. There are no term limits. So as long as they continue to be elected, they could continue being elected every 2 years. This is almost a volunteer position. They're only paid $100 a year, which does not include their license plates. The average age of our New Hampshire legislature is about 62, and there's about 33% legislator turnover each election cycles. Now, we just had our election, and there were a fair amount of people that had either decided not to run, retired, or had chosen to run for another seat, if you will. In New Hampshire, you can't run for 2 seats at the same time. So, for example, former Senate President Chuck Morse, went for a run for the U.S. Senate. He did not make it, so therefore he was ineligible to run this term. As an example, did he want to? I don't know, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Jen, did you want to say something?
This is a very large legislative body. And I've heard some people say, well, it's so large, how can they even get anything done? Yada, yada, yada. Well, there are some benefits of having a very large legislature because of the size of the New Hampshire legislature. That means that our legislators are much more accessible than in some other states. When you're standing in line at your local post office, or I don't know, filling up gas at your local gas station, or checking a book out at your town library, the person behind you or ahead of you might be one of your state representatives. They might live down the street or around the corner, and are usually, pretty well known in that community. And it's easy to find information, to reach out, invite one of your legislators or your House representatives to maybe meet for coffee or tea, or even to meet you in your home, meet your family member with a disability, and start building a relationship. These legislators are going to make some really important decisions that impact you and your families. And legislators can't know everything about every bill or legislative topic or issue. And unless your lives have been touched by disability, you may just not know what you don't know. And as parents, family members, or if you're a professional in the field, you truly have invaluable information and perspective to offer legislators so that they can make responsible decisions. So do know that you have something really important that you can offer them, and that they really, most times, they really welcome and want to meet you, and they want to know what you know so they can do a good job. Regardless of political affiliation, this is basically a volunteer gig. They really feel like they can contribute something and help New Hampshire to make it the best place it can be. So you developing a relationship with them will help them to represent New Hampshire citizens in the best way possible.
Well said, Jen. Jen, I think this is yours. You do this one better than I do.
Oh, okay, sure. So there are different types of legislatures throughout our nation. And you'll notice on this map that, you see a variety of different colors. Some states have legislatures that are full-time, and they're paid quite a large salary to serve in that position. Whereas New Hampshire, like we mentioned before, it's almost a volunteer type of position. We're considered one of the gold light states. But you have some states like that are green, like California, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania. Those green states, as an example, they might pay their legislators, the print is small, and is that 82? I don't know if you can see my pointer, Karen. It's small, I can't read
It
it.
is 80,000,
I think it's 82,000.
yeah.
Yes, okay, I zoomed in on my other screen here. So $82,358 is like their average compensation, plus they have paid staff. Unless you're like the Speaker of the House here in New Hampshire or the Senate President, you're not necessarily going to have paid staff. So that's another, benefit, I suppose, for states that have like full-time legislators. That they have that support and some additional resources to be able to do their jobs. But some would argue, some New Hampshire legislators will be like, hey, if you want to do this, then, you need to do it on a volunteer basis and for the greater good. You probably thought for a moment, wow, the average age of a New Hampshire legislator is about 62 years old. Because honestly, unless you're retired or maybe you're a private business owner, it might be difficult for you to run for state house rep or a state Senate position because, you have to work to support yourself. So oftentimes we see folks who have either retired or business owners serve and be able to take that time to run for election, campaign, and then to put in the time during the legislative session. But I wanted you to be aware, just, the way that we do it in New Hampshire isn't necessarily how it's done everywhere else in the nation.
All right, something that was very important for this election season, we had redistricting. So what that is we have a census every 10 years. After that census is complete, legislatures, New Hampshire, for example, take those numbers and then they change the districts a little bit based on the new census, so the new population in that district. So for example, what you can see on the screen, which is a graphic from NHPR, is just the Senate districts. So if you look at 1992 and that little blue top, that was the Senate district for region 1. And then 2002, look, it's changed a little bit. And then 2000, the next one over, sorry, I can't see with the my bubble of people. 2012, and now looking at 2022, it's changed significantly again. So for example, I live in North Woodstock, which is up in the White Mountains. And last year, my senator, as well as the senator of Lincoln, because Lincoln and Woodstock work together, we all were Senate Region 1. Now, Lincoln is Region 3. And Woodstock, which is a little further south, remains Region 1. It's very interesting how that all goes. More extreme example is the executive council seats. Those changed as well. I went from living in executive council seat 1's region, and now I am in executive council region 2. So this only happens once every 10 years, but we wanted to make sure that we highlighted this because, when you went to the ballot, if you went and voted, you may have looked at, where your region was and was like, hey, that's not who I had last time, and it might not have been. If you're interested in finding out about redistricting, you can actually go to the Secretary of State's website. They have additional information about that as well.
And the redistricting is supposed to be based on the census numbers, which is important to participate in your census. I'll put a little plug in there so you can be counted. But look at how that blue area has migrated so far south.
Yeah.
Does that mean that more people have moved more to the southern part of the state because this is based on population? I haven't analyzed all of this, but I thought it was really interesting how that blue from 1992 to 2002, look at how that blue area has migrated down south, and look at how that brighter pink area has expanded over that period of time.
Jen, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So here are some facts about the New Hampshire General Court. And we've updated the slide with the 2022 numbers. As you may have read in the media and seen on the news, there have been some recounts and things are still very much pending. But I can tell you that there is a very close, even 50-50 split in the New Hampshire House. There's definitely a Republican majority in our New Hampshire State Senate. And of course, we have a Republican sitting governor as well. Certainly we'll likely see a slight majority in the House. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but that seems to be what I'm hearing from other people that analyze this stuff, but they won't have a veto majority. So that's important. After the previous election, we had a Republican governor, we had a Republican majority in both bodies, both the New Hampshire House and the New Hampshire Senate. That's sort of like the trifecta and presents a really strong policy window that you could anticipate that the majority party can put forward legislative proposals and policies during that time and advance their agenda. And the same holds true if and when Democrats might have that trifecta of having the governor's office in both bodies. When you have it split, it's unlikely that controversial policies are going to pass. What you are going to see is more legislative bills and policies that have bipartisan support to go forward. So much remains to be seen. We'll see where things land. I know that on the national stage, Georgia was definitely in the spotlight today. And honestly, between work and preparing for tonight's presentation, I haven't even listened to the news yet. So I'm really excited to hear about what happens with that. Has anyone, maybe you listened to the radio on the way home, or maybe you had the radio on in the office, or you tuned in already for your 4:30 news? Anybody have any updates about Georgia? No. All right. Well, I guess we shall see. And then there's some other fun facts there. Oh, Michelle.
So you said most likely the House will have a Republican majority, but then you said something after that I didn't catch, but they won't have a
veto majority.
A veto majority.
Right.
Okay.
So, yeah, which may not really matter as much because we also have a Republican governor, but let's say both legislative bodies, our New Hampshire House and our New Hampshire Senate, passed a legislative bill, and it was sent to the governor's desk. But for whatever reason, maybe the governor was like, no, I don't think this is ready to become law. And let's say the governor were to veto the bill, it would have to come back to the legislative bodies. And there's is it 3/4 majority, Karen?
2/3.
2/3.
2/3.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of like a constitutional amendment or something. There will only be a slight, I think there'll be a slight Republican lead by what, less than maybe 5 or 3. So we'll have to see how that pans out.
And thank you for taking that, Jen. I needed a cough drop quickly. I believe that we are at 198 for the Democrats, and I think we're still holding at 202 or 201 for the Republican Party. Just to add, on tomorrow is actually called Organization Day. That's when all of the newly elected will be sworn in, and it doesn't start the legislative session, but it does start the organization of the government.
I think it's likely that we'll see Senator Jeb Bradley be elected as Senate President. And from what I understand, there might be a newcomer for the New Hampshire House Speaker. So that's still pending as well.
And that will be available if you go to the general court. We'll show you that that website in a little bit, but the Gen Court website tomorrow, it will be live streamed and it is a joint session.
Yeah, on the left-hand side of this slide, it does say Sherman Packard, House Speaker. He was the speaker from the former session,
Right.
and Majority Leader was Bradley. We're looking, it's likely that he's going to serve on there. One interesting thing is with the reelection of, with the most recent election, members of our House Finance Committee, we're looking at all new or mostly new House representatives that are going to serve on that committee. And given that we have a biennium budget, and this year during this legislative session, we're going to be working on the state budget, and the state budget will outline how much funding there will be for developmental services, services for people with acquired brain injuries, the CFI waiver as well. There's not going to be a lot of institutional knowledge, and we're seeing the same type of thing over in the Senate as well. So it'll be more important than ever for families and individuals when there are budget hearings to go share a short story about your situation, your family, or yourself as an individual, explain how important services are in order for you to live a good life and contribute, and to ask for them to make funding for these services a priority. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this shows you like year by year, the partisan composition, you know, whether we had, you know, who was in the governor's seat, which party was in the governor's seat, Senate, state Senate, and state House. You'll notice like there was from 1992 to 96, you had a trifecta, right? Republican governor, Republican-led House, and a Republican-led Senate. And then we saw a switch over in 1997 to a Democratic senator, but the Senate, state Senate, and state House still remained Republican. In a divided government like that, it's kind of hard to pass anything that's controversial. You don't typically see anything controversial passed there unless, of course, the legislature, the House and Senate, have a veto majority. Then they could override a governor's veto. And then in 2003 and 2004, we saw the trifecta again for Republicans in the governor's office, the state Senate, and also the House. Then we had a Democratic governor for a couple of years. And then from 2007 to 2010, we had a trifecta for Democrats. We had a Democratic governor, Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, and things switched over again. On the bottom of this slide, you see for the New Hampshire State Senate party control, 1992 through 2020. Of course, it's sort of up in the air still until the final numbers are, you know, announced and posted on the Secretary of State's website. And of course, for the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and you can see the number splits between, you know, like how many Democrats and how many Republicans were elected for those particular years. And you always see some kind of like changes within a legislative session because, you know, unfortunately, with legislative bodies, with legislators that are average age of, you know, in their 60s, some are older, some pass away, and then in some cases, some will decide to leave the legislature for personal reasons or other reasons, and sometimes there are special elections. So these numbers can change slightly, even once we get the final numbers from the Secretary of State's office. You know, during the next few months, things could change, and then we might need to do a special election. So there's always a little bit of change here and there. But yeah, I thought you might find this interesting.
Okay, and just to kind of highlight how many bills are actually considered in a given legislative session. We're going to talk more about how a bill becomes a law, but our legislative session runs from January until June. generally speaking. And we, as you can see, in 2021, there were 776 bills that were introduced, and only 245 that were completed. But just to highlight, you know, our legislators needed to learn about 776 bills that are broken down into each of the committees, which we'll talk about later. So again, just to echo again what Jen had said about, you know, getting to know your legislators. They really want to get to know you. They really need your help to make the best decision possible about all of these bills. There is no way that they can learn about all of the topics, even if it sits in their committee of expertise, if you will. I did want to highlight 2020. Originally, there was 1,222 bills, and only 45 were completed. If you all remember, pandemic hit in March of 2020, and the legislature shut down. At that time, there was not the ability to do legislative work online. They quickly pivoted, and at least some of the bills were completed, and not by both necessarily by both bodies. But I'm not going to get into that. But you know, just to take a look at again, you know, just thinking about our basically legislative, you know, volunteer legislature, they do an awful lot of work for the state. Did you want to add anything, Jen?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway here is, you know, only a small percentage of bills will make it through. It's even less than that on the federal level. And I know some people might be like, oh, these legislators, you know, they're not doing their job. Well, this is actually by design. Our forefathers who constructed our democracy and wrote our Constitution, you know, created this structure for a purpose. Not every idea for a law is a good idea. And before, you know, we make, you know, significant changes, we want to make sure that it's not going to have, you know, unintended consequences or too many unintended consequences. So it's really by design. So if you're thinking that, well, they should be passing more laws and, you know, working harder, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not working hard. It just, maybe some policy proposals are just not quite ready yet for prime time. And it's all by design.
All right, so let's pause here. And before we get into how a bill becomes a law, and if anyone has any questions or comments. Go ahead, Michelle.
What are the political party affiliations of the executive counselors? Do you know?
Well, they're elected officials, and, you know, either they identify and run on the ticket as a Republican or governor, I'm sorry, as a Republican or a Democrat. So it's not any different than if you're running for elected office as governor or as, you know, for state representative or state senate. We have a two-party system in the United States and in New Hampshire.
So what I meant was like the 5 that are in there now.
Okay.
Are they all Republican? Are they, what's the?
It's a Republican majority. There are 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat currently.
Thank you.
And of course, we have a Republican governor who also sits on the executive council. Yeah, and you know, some would argue, and I would too, and I think it's actually a fact that New Hampshire has the weakest governorship. He can't appoint his own cabinet. He can't appoint his own commissioners or judges like many other governors. He has to have approval and consensus on his executive council. Clearly, that's easier if the members of his or her executive council are of the same party. But there were years, like, for example, when Maggie Hassan served as governor, I believe she had a Republican majority for a term on the executive council. So it can be a little challenging when, you know, you have a governor who's of one party, but the other party is the majority on your executive council. So the governor needs that approval and buy-in and consensus from that body. And again, this was a throwback from the colonial days. They were really concerned about centralized power in government. And that's why they opted, when creating our New Hampshire government, to include the executive council. And that's why today you might hear a lot of conversations if you're watching, political news stories and listening to commentary. There's always this like tension between centralized federal power and what the federal government can tell us what we have to do versus like state autonomy and power and ability to make decisions for themselves. And that the framers of our Constitution that created this structure of government, they wanted to be careful and they wanted to make sure that we would avoid centralized power and, a strong group coming in and taking over and living under the same conditions that they left when, they came here to America.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Okay, next up is how a bill becomes a law in New Hampshire. We will be sending, as follow-up to this meeting, a copy of this PowerPoint so that you will have access to all of the links. But I don't know if anyone else recognizes this this wonderful young bill over on the left-hand side. That is from Schoolhouse Rock, and that was how I learned as a child how a bill generally becomes a law. And New Hampshire works very similarly as the federal government in some respects. So any bill, thanks Kenda, any bill has to go through the process with each of the two legislative bodies. So the New Hampshire General Court session, again, another holdover from colonial days. The General Court is actually with our legislature. Runs from January to June, but they are already working. In the fall, they have to put in what's called a legislative service request, or LSR, and that is a precursor to a bill. The New Hampshire House has already completed their filing period, and the New Hampshire Senate is filing right now. Those initial precursor are just one line. So we begin to kind of watch those bills just based on a single sentence a lot of the time. So what's happening now is that they have an idea. They have an idea, or a constituent came to them with an idea, and they take that idea and make it into the LSR, or the legislative service request. Any bill, LSR, has to have a senator, has to have a sponsor of a sitting either House member or senator in New Hampshire. Now, what's happening behind the scenes, especially in the Hampshire House, is that the Legislative Service Department is working with the prime sponsor to draft the bill language. It is assigned an LSR number, but once it is introduced, the LSR number goes away, and then it'll be assigned a bill number and will be sent to a committee once the legislative session starts in January. Okay, so legislative session has started, and the LSR has been introduced. It is now a bill. So as you can see on our left-hand side, our lovely little bill now has a button that says bill. That is not a law. He is just a bill, and only a bill. What happens is every bill gets assigned to a committee that makes the most sense for that bill to live in. So there are bills that we can look at, that generally have to do with health and human services, and that bill will be assigned to Health and Human Services in its originating legislative body. So If a bill is sponsored by a House member, it will originate in the New Hampshire House, and it will retain its beginning letters, HB, and the bill number. Once it's a bill, the bill number doesn't change. The title may change, but the bill number doesn't change. And once it's in committee, every bill has to have minimally one public hearing. And the committee will have the public hearing. They'll also have work sessions to continue to work on that and other bills. And then it will go through the committee process, and they will have an executive session. At the executive session, the committee will choose one of well, more than one, but generally OTP, which is ought to pass, which means yes, this bill should go forward, or ITL, which is inexpedient to legislate, which no, the bill shouldn't go through at this time. Then there are other things like interim study that they could do as well, which quietly kills the bill. And then, but if a bill has a fiscal note, which is, you'll see, HB, I don't know, 220 FN. If it has an FN, that's a fiscal note, and it generally will go to the finance committee of its originating body. Now, if it passes the committee, it goes to the full body. If the full body passes it, then it crosses over into the other legislative body, and the whole process starts again. So for any bill, generally speaking, we'll minimally have one public hearing in the House, one public hearing in the Senate, or vice versa, depending on where it originated, before it hits the governor's desk, which is really important. And as a transplant, yes, I've lived here 17 years, but it still amazes me that we have so many opportunities to speak up about our legislative process. If there's a public hearing for every single bill, at least twice before it hits the governor's desk, potentially, that is unheard of public access. All right.
Karen, I do have a question.
Sure.
What is, like, you said we have 400 in the New Hampshire House.
Yep.
And some other states, as like I saw on the map, that don't have anything at all, as far as set up like our federal government.
Mm-hmm.
How many is is there anybody else who's even close to us in the amount?
It's a really good question. We are the 4th largest English-speaking legislature in the world. We are behind just the federal government.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There was a green pickup truck.
I really like the, oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. I think there's also one state that only has like one chamber body.
And to him,
Yeah.
it appeared like they were arguing.
That is true.
The man was pointing his finger at the
And,
woman.
when you take a look across the country, like Jen had highlighted before, they don't always meet at the same, some don't even meet yearly. So, it really depends on what the people of that state want and what their constitution says.
Right. And if you're wondering, like, why is it so varied and different? Well, because states want that local control. They are like, hey, we know what's best for us in our state based on, our situation, our geographics and our population and people. They have the decision-making power to, when they put forward their state constitutions, to structure in a way that they thought would be most beneficial to their citizens.
And
Yeah,
also,
that's what I was going to say, was that the bipartisanship is so important in New Hampshire, which I appreciate. I'm from Louisiana, obviously, by my accent, so there's a big difference here. Thanks.
Okay.
thank you. All right, committee of conference.
So Karen has talked a little bit about, that journey that a bill goes on until it becomes law. But there are a lot of like little things that can happen as it makes its way through the state legislature. So what happens if you have a bill and let's say the first body, it starts in the House and the House is like, this is a great idea. Okay, the committee considers it, they drill down, they hear public testimony, they make a recommendation to the full body. Hey, you got to pass this. This is a great idea. It crosses over in March, goes to the other body, the Senate, the New Hampshire Senate. And they're like, well, this is a pretty good idea, but we think it needs to be tweaked just a little bit. Otherwise, there might be some unintended consequences. So they make a slight change to the bill. Now the bill is different, right? What the first body, the House passed is a little bit different than what the Senate, what the Senate passed. So what happens when you have these differences between the two bodies? Well, we have something called the Committee of Conference. And this is where representatives from both the House and the Senate are appointed by their majority leaders within that body. They come together and they try to negotiate a compromise between the two differences. And if so, then it'll go back to both bodies. The full bodies will have to vote to accept that change. And if it is accepted in both bodies, then it would move on to the governor for consideration. So this Committee of Conference is a way to sort of negotiate any differences that might happen when changes are made as the bill makes its way through the legislative process and makes its way through both bodies.
So question, Jen, does the House Bill 1 and House Bill 2 that are the bills or the basis of the state budget, does that go to a committee of conference?
So HB 1 and HB 2 will, every year that we have a state legislative session where we're developing our state budget, and we have a biennium budget, so that doesn't happen every year, it's every other or every 2 years. Yeah, if, for example, it's a little bit more complicated than that too, but yeah, if there are differences between the House's proposal for the budget from the Senate's proposal, then they need to negotiate the differences. If they don't put anything forward to the governor, then the governor can't consider that proposal. But remember, the governor also has, in this case, because it's Governor Sununu is a man, has his ideas about what should be included in the budget. And he may not always agree, even with his own legislature. For example, the last time around when we were working on the budget, he didn't necessarily agree even with members of his own party that were serving in the majority. And there was still some discussions and negotiations that had to happen in order for the legislature to bring something forward that they knew that the governor would accept, because the governor does have that power to veto and send it back to the legislature if he doesn't agree. I mean, there are obviously some consequences to, vetoing something like that. We don't want to see the state government shut down or anything like that. And there are some mechanisms in place to keep our essential government running in those times where our legislative bodies and or the governor can't agree on a budget proposal. There have been years where they've worked well into the summer beyond that June date in order to come to a compromise and pass a state budget into law. But HB 1 and HB 2, those will be it'll start in the House, HB, House Bill, that's what it stands for. The House will consider it first. There's been a lot of activity happening behind the scenes leading up to the legislative session. During the summer, each one of the state departments was working on a budget proposal that they submitted to the governor. The governor's working on his budget. And in, I believe it's February. Is it February or March? February.
I believe it's February 15th.
Okay. He will present in a public forum in Representative Hall his proposal for a budget, and he does a speech. And then, of course, the New Hampshire House will be the first legislative body to take up the budget, HB 1 and HB 2, the budget bills. They will put together their proposal and then it'll go over to the Senate And then the Senate will have a chance to make their tweaks and changes. They'll have to work out their differences.
Mhm.
And then hopefully it will be in line with what the governor would be willing to accept for a budget as well.
And just to add on to that, so just to let people know that, you know, when you're talking the budget bills, they are enormous. There is so much included in those bills, but our governor, the way that it is set up in our state, the governor, it's an all or nothing veto. You either accept it all or you veto it all. We do not in our state have the ability of line item vetoes. If for some reason, like Jen was saying, that they can't come to a compromise and July 1st, you know, the new budget's supposed to start, that what they do is they quickly pass a continuing resolution. And what that means is that the funding structure that they had will just continue until they can come to a compromise.
Yeah, and that's another example of how New Hampshire has the weakest governorship. There are some governors that can veto like a specific line or even passage within a bill, whereas our governor only has 3 choices. So let's just say that there's a bill, it passed through both the House and the Senate, wasn't controversial, had bipartisan support. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it wasn't amended. And both committees and the full bodies approved it, crossed over, got that approval in the second body, and was sent to the governor. The governor has 3 options. The governor can allow the bill to become law without his or her signature. The governor can sign the bill into law, or the governor can veto the entire bill. No options for sections or taking out lines of the legislation like some other governors have the ability to do. It's all or nothing. And I will say as well, and we're going to be getting to a graphic here in a moment, the most important part of the legislative process where you can hope to have the most influential impact about the outcome of a proposed bill or policy is at the committee level.
Yeah.
It's going to be really important if you are working on legislative, public policy, and advocacy to get to know who the members are of the committees, the key committees that consider legislative public policy that impacts people with developmental and other disabilities. They are going to make a recommendation to the full body. And most often, not all the time, but most often, whatever that recommendation is, the full body will respect the work of the committee and they'll do what the committee is recommending. There are some unique examples where the committee might have said, we recommend OTP ought to pass. Maybe someone wrote up a minority report and then the full body ended up voting it down, or the other way around. But most often, the committee, because they're taking the time to read the bill, examine it, listen to public testimony, they then have an executive session after the public hearing, sometimes the same day, sometimes a couple days later or the next week, where they will do a final consideration, and then the bill will vote whether they want to pass it, whether they want to kill it, ITL, or maybe they send it to interim study, or there are other potential things that can happen too. But I don't want to confuse you. I just want you to understand like the higher level process. You might be wondering, like, why would the governor allow something to become law without his or her signature? Well, maybe for, political reasons. They don't want to get in the way to stop a certain policy, but they don't exactly want to endorse it with their name as well. There could be a variety of different reasons why a governor might sign something versus allowing it to become law without his or her signature. All right, so here's a graphic on this next slide that just basically shows you that journey that the bill goes on. Where do these ideas come from for a bill? A lot of times there are citizens who approach their New Hampshire House representative, or they might approach their state senator and say, you know what, there's something that we really need to have in law. I would like you to put forward a bill that does X, Y, and Z. So citizens usually, have a lot of those ideas. Sometimes legislators, they're also citizens, might come up with their own ideas for bills as well. And then, of course, it'll go to the bodies. If it's a representative that is sponsoring the bill, it'll start in the House. If it's a state senator, it'll start in the New Hampshire Senate. Then, of course, it goes to the committees. If it passes both bodies, then the governor signs it. And then, of course, you have the veto situation where with a certain percentage of votes, if the governor vetoes it, it still has a chance to become law. That doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes it can, depending on what the numbers are for the political affiliations in the legislative bodies. And on the next slide, this is another graphic that your brain might appreciate. On the left-hand side, you have the House. On the right-hand side, you have the Senate. You see how the bill can be introduced into either body, depending on who is sponsoring it. If it's a senator, it'll be introduced to the Senate first. If it's a New Hampshire House rep, it'll be introduced to the House first. It'll be assigned to a committee that is, most knowledgeable about the topic of that bill. And then the committee does its process of having that public hearing, voting on it, and making a recommendation to the full body, and it'll go to floor action. Floor action means it's being considered by that full body, either the full House or the full Senate. If it passes the full body, then it'll cross over to the other body, and it will go through that same process. If it survives both bodies, then it eventually will go on to the governor. If it dies in the first body and it gets killed, then it will not cross over to the other body. So that's why Karen was saying that every bill has at least one public hearing on its journey. If it's a good bill and it makes its way to the second body, then it will definitely have a second public hearing. And obviously, if it has a fiscal note, if it generates money or is going to cost the state money, then it will also be considered by a finance committee. Sometimes a bill might even be referred to a third committee. It's not something that happens all the time, but if I won't get into the weeds of it, but sometimes it might even be sent to a third committee based on the content of the bill and what it could do and who it could impact. And at the bottom is the link to this graphic.
Sorry, I had to mute for a second. So tracking legislation. Now, we're talking about so many bills, but there are only so many bills that maybe you are interested in. So it's really important to know how to find out the information as this process is going along. Okay, the best place to get information is the New Hampshire General Court website. And again, I know when I first moved to the state, I'm like, General Court, like, what does that got to do with the legislature? Again, it's a holdover from colonial times, and it's another way for New Hampshire to be a little unique. Now, they have updated the website, and it is actually a lot easier to use. So if we look at, so the link here is www.gencourt.state.nh.us. You have information on the House, the Senate, all of the laws or RSAs, some budget information, administrative rules, and also the visitor center. That's where you can also get that link for that virtual tour. Now,
and remember, don't be confused. We call it the Gen Court, but this is not.
It is not the judicial branch at all. Okay, so down here they've added quick links, which was really helpful. How to contact a representative. That'll bring you a link to find out who your representative is, who your senator is. But down here at the bottom, see current bills, find a bill. You can put the bill number in there and it'll bring you to the bill, which effectively is the docket, if you will, where you can get the full bill language, where it's currently sitting, what's happened so far. You will also get information on this initial webpage of any public hearings. And again, post 2020, we don't know yet what the rules are going to be on virtual participation. However, what has happened so far is that we've gone from the only way you can watch what's going on in a public hearing or a committee meeting is that you had to be in the building. And they now routinely have it so you can at least watch the proceedings, which is really helpful for the people far flung from Concord can jump on and take a look at what's happening. The other thing that they have, which under the session information, that'll tell you when that there's going to be the next full session of each legislative body, and there'll also be links there to be able to watch those as well. Now, during the 2020 legislative session, people were able to testify online. They were also able to sign into a bill. Signing into a bill means to give your support, yay or nay or neutral, and an easy way to submit written testimony. Given the current makeup, I am not as hopeful that we will be bringing back some of those things, but what seems to be here to stay is the ability to watch the public hearings, and that in itself is a huge help. Okay, looking ahead. So already, what we had talked about earlier is the New Hampshire House has completed their LSRs. The New Hampshire Senate is in the process of doing theirs. Again, LSRs, a legislative service request, which is the precursor to any bill in a legislative session. We have a few that we're already watching. They are generally about the BDS system redesign. One is to hold to have a study commission before changes to any of the waivers. Another one is for setting up a pilot project. I believe there's a third one that has to do with quality control and having things be run by the Quality Council. Again, we do not have full language on any of these yet. We're just really kind of going off of that one sentence. Another one that we're just keeping a quick eye on is one about DSP rates. So once the legislative session gets rolling, we will be sharing more of the bills that CSNI is going to be following.
Yeah, now that the House filing period has passed, there are still some senators can still file some confidential bill titles. So there are going to be some surprises that we might not know. So in the next 2 to 3 months, we're really going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, we'll be very busy figuring out, what these bills are. So if you see an LSR with the title there and you're like, that might be something I'm interested in, you could always reach out, go on nh.gov. There's a House roster and a Senate roster. You can find out the contact information for that sponsor online, and you could actually reach out, either email or call that legislator and ask them, say, hey, I noticed you filed LSR blah. Tell me a little bit more about this. What's the intent of your bill? What are you trying to accomplish? Then they might share some more information with you. So there's a lot that will be unfolding in the next 2 to 3 months.
Correct.
Oh, is that me? Oh, no, it's you.
No, it's me. Okay. In case you haven't noticed, Jen and I have done this presentation or similar presentations in the past. So some other ways other than the general court that you can follow bills is using there are free you know, legislative tracking, if you will, and, you know, like Legiscan, you can put in the bill numbers that you're following, and you can get alerts when there's any changes. The other one that's great on here is Congress. We really do need to keep an eye on what's going on federally. So going to congress.gov, you can look up key search words for bills that you might be interested in as well. Now, I know we're really only talking about the state, but it is important to note that we have a legislature from January to June. The federal government has 2-year Congresses that at any point during that Congress, they can submit a bill. So, you know, when you hear in the news, sometimes like, hey, I've been hearing about this bill for, it seems like a long time. It might be.
And federally, I mean, we're really expecting to see what's considered a lame duck Congress moving forward due to the outcome of the most recent election. And what that really means is that because of the differences in party control in the different bodies, it's unlikely that anything controversial will pass. The legislative policies that do pass will require a bipartisan support for them to make it through and become law.
Okay, so we actually have a list of all of the area agencies. I know that the print is really tough to see, but we will send this to you so that you can see it. And it's each of the regions as well as the link to each of their websites so that you can find out more about the area agency in your region. Now, another great way to keep up with what's going on is to contact your legislative liaison or equivalent in for each of your area agencies. Almost all of them have a legislative liaison. I formerly was Region 1's for Northern Human Services before I went to CSNI. You know, you can contact each one of these legislative liaisons, and they would be more than happy to keep you updated on what's happening in Concord. There's Jen.
Yes, it's so important to know what's going on and what's happening. I'm just curious. Let's do a little activity here. In the chat, could you put in 1 to 2 topics that you're most interested in? I mean, you're here for a reason tonight, so you have some interest in public policy and legislative advocacy. So what, 1 or 2 topics are the topics you feel most passionate about or are most interested in? I'm just curious what you're thinking about. Okay, person-centered planning, transportation. Really important issue, especially here in New Hampshire. It's a challenge in the Granite State. Others, anyone, education or maybe Medicaid funding, or is there a cap on what you can pay direct sports staff? There's a policy on a cap, but if there are reasons why someone needs to be paid more, you can submit a letter of justification and reasoning why you would need to pay a direct support professional, a personal care attendant, at a higher rate. And if you want to reach out to Karen or I to get some more information about that, either tonight or tomorrow or moving forward, then feel free. I have a document where I could share with you about the policy that's in place, but it does allow for people to submit a letter of justification in cases where it does require someone to be paid at a higher rate because of the nature of the care that they're providing for the individual. The BDS system redesign, yes. So that won't be, well, we probably will see a legislative. This will come up in the legislative session this year. Previously, this work had been taking place primarily through the Bureau of Developmental Services, which again, remember, is within the Department of Health and Human Services here in New Hampshire. And they do have work groups set up and so on and so forth. But there've been a lot of concerns shared on the part of families and individuals around some of these proposed changes. One of which is that the initial organization that came in and did an evaluation and made recommendations, they didn't consult with, parents like myself or like you or individuals like yourself before they made those recommendations. And then people that have been serving on those work groups, have brought forward some concerns around feeling not heard and not having any decision-making authority. Certainly there are some good things that can come out of doing some of this systems work around improving and innovating our technologies so our systems can be more efficient. But there's an upcoming BDS public forum.
Tomorrow.
Is it tomorrow night?
Tomorrow.
Yeah, I shared a legislative information on it on Community Crossroads. You can go to our Facebook page. So I shared out the information on there, and I know that Karen, you shared out for CSNI as well. I've seen it on LinkedIn, and you probably have it posted on your website too.
Yeah.
Your voices, your experiences, and your input is important. You matter. Our developmental service system was founded upon the notion of nothing about us without us. We need to have a say about, the structure of our system and how it works, because we're living that life, and the system was intended, to serve families and individuals like yourselves.
Yep, there are, and thank you, Steve, as well. General understanding of the process. Thank you. So there's about 3 or 4 in the House right now. There may be more that have to do with BDS system redesign. There could be more with the Senate. Representative Jerry Stringham, I believe it's LSR 607, is looking at the cap rate as well on DSPs.
Yes, and last legislative session, huge bipartisan effort supported on a bipartisan level. The governor finally signed into law the bill that created an adult Medicaid dental benefit that's slated to begin in 2023. Such an important piece of legislation. And that's a really good example. It took more than 8 years on the part of advocates to develop relationships with lawmakers to help educate them about the importance of providing this dental benefit. New Hampshire had been like one of 16 states in the United States that didn't offer it to adults. And you might be wondering, well, why? Why are kids automatically able to access it, but not adults? Well, some services under Medicaid are considered mandatory services, and oral health, access to oral health care is a mandatory service for children, but it wasn't a mandatory service for adults.
Right.
The feds left it up to states to decide whether or not they wanted to include it in their Medicaid programs. And for years, New Hampshire had made that decision not to include it until just last legislative session. So that's a very exciting development and a really important example, a tangible example of the power we have as advocates when we foster relationships with our lawmakers. We share our experiences and our stories, that we can influence their decision-making, and we can ensure that we have responsible policies and programs that help to ensure an individual's dignity and ability to live in their chosen home and live a meaningful life. And some of the most consequential policies that we've passed in the last 25, 50 years have been brought forward, and they've made it to the finish line because of individual family advocacy. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to find out who got elected, who's your state representative, who's your state senator. Reach out to them, invite them over, meet them for coffee or tea, ask them, so what are your priorities this legislative session? and get to know them. So when there's a bill that you would really like them to support or maybe oppose because it could create more barriers for yourself or your family member to live a meaningful life, that you can reach out to them and you can ask them for their support or opposition on something, and offer to be a resource to them. Hey, you know what? When you see something come across your desk, a policy or bill that would impact families like mine, feel free to reach out and give me a call. And I'll let you know, how that might impact, a family like ourselves.
And just on this page, for other groups that also do policy watch, Bonnie Dunham has fantastic updates, especially on special education. You can also contact Jeff Dickinson at GSIL. Vanessa Blaze is the new Director of Policy at the DD Council. The DD Council also from time to time will give you a heads up about federal legislation as well. And Lisa Bowden at ABLE.
So all of these entities have some type of legislative newsletter. So definitely take time, visit their websites. They have excellent resources available on their websites as well, and reach out and say, hey, can you please add me to your newsletter or your legislative policy watch? They'll send updates about what's happening. They'll let you know if there's a bill that's of consequence. They'll share talking points and here's what you can do, calls to action. Oh, call your New Hampshire House rep or the member of the House and Human Services and Elderly Affairs Committee. So they'll share information about how you can come together with other advocates. Together we can have the power to make the kind of change and craft a better future for the future.
And just to put out there, we watch, CSNI watches those as well. Community Crossroads does a fantastic job as well. But sometimes the focus, if your focus is education, you want to get in touch with the Parent Information Center. Like, we will follow them, but they may do a little more in depth.
My contact information is on the slide for Region 10 area agencies. If policy advocacy, if you've gotten the bug and you really love it and you want to spend more time engaging in public policy advocacy, then you might want to consider our Policy Partners program. It starts in September and it runs through March each year. And it's basically a course that helps give you more skills and the ability to engage in public policy advocacy. So it's something to think about if this is something that you really feel passionate about. As a parent, I feel like I can't die until there are more responsible policies and programs that will ensure my daughter's dignity and ability to live a meaningful life.
Agreed. And some additional information, again, myself, CSNI, you can also contact us. We are planning, generally speaking, more events like this going forward. We also have Tuxeya at the New Hampshire Governor's Commission on Disability. The Governor's Commission on Disability is also a good resource for if you want more information about the stable accounts. So stable NH, that's a great place to look if you're considering that. And Ellen Edgerly for the Brain Injury Association too.
And they have monthly policy meetings that you can join if you're interested. They're open to anyone who has an interest. So feel free to reach out to Ellen and ask her to include you on her email tree if that's something you want to do. Okay, so here are some national organizations that have some very valuable resources. I really recommend that you visit their websites. ADAPT is a growing grassroots organization that does actions to help encourage lawmakers to pass responsible policies that remove barriers and increase opportunities for people with disabilities. The ARC is an incredible resource, especially on the public policy front. They have all kinds of information about what's happening? What are the most innovative ideas and what can we bring to New Hampshire? For example, it was some of the ARC's resources that I learned about the ABLE Act.
Mhm.
The ABLE Act was the first tax-free savings vehicle for people with disabilities. And I learned about it there. It was passed on the federal level. And then while I was serving on the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities on their policy committee, I helped to work to educate lawmakers, and we passed a bill to enable the state legislation or to pass the state enabling legislation so that we could offer ABLE accounts here in New Hampshire. We call them stable accounts. You might, find that familiar, but there's another example of, I was just a mom of a daughter who had a developmental disability. I got involved first with the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities. I went through the New Hampshire Leadership Series to learn more about policy. And then in 2018, I made the decision to go back to graduate school, and I earned a Master of Arts in Public Policy. Well, actually, Karen and I did that together.
We did. We also
Yeah.
did the DD Council and worked on ABLE together too.
These organizations have very valuable resources. So if you are looking for things to help share with lawmakers here in New Hampshire, if you're supporting a certain piece of legislation on a certain topic, these organizations have some of the best resources available to advocates like us.
Mhm. Yes, and just as a plug for Jen, I also did New Hampshire Leaderships, and I was a part of the DD Council, but I was Community Crossroads' first mentee as a part of the LEND program, and Jen was my mentor.
Yeah, so New Hampshire LEND is a program that's run at the University of New Hampshire. Leadership education in neurodevelopmental and other related disabilities.
Good job.
And as a family member, I believe it still comes with a stipend as well. So it makes it affordable for you to be able to take the time to go through that program. You get to be placed in a leadership and action placement. I offer a policy leadership and action placement for the last 10 years. And then you also do clinical placements. It's a great opportunity to learn more about how you can work more effectively on an interdisciplinary team and make all kinds of connections both on the state level and on the national level. If you're thinking maybe in the future you want to pursue some type of career path along the lines of advocacy and policy, or within other institutions that serve individuals with developmental and other disabilities. But Dr. Betsy Humphreys is the person to reach out to if you're interested in that. And you can look it up on their website.
Yep, New Hampshire Leadership and LEND, I believe they opened their applications in April, May, something like that.
The Kaiser Foundation, which is listed at the very bottom of this slide, they have some of the most valuable data around, Medicaid services. So if you're writing up a letter of testimony and you're interested, well, what's the average cost of institutional care versus home and community-based services? They would be a great resource to go to for data and information. They are a little bit left of center, but they're generally respected by both party affiliations. New Hampshire Behavioral Health Centers, if some individuals with developmental and other disabilities might have a comorbid diagnosis and also have behavioral health needs. So here are our New Hampshire Community Behavioral Health Centers. There are some phone numbers and website information if that's information that's important to you. And of course, here are some state and also national mental health resources that might be of use. NAMI, of course, is both a state and national organization. We've got the American Psychiatric Association, and of course, the New Hampshire Community Behavioral Health Association. And typically, all of these organizations that you've seen on like this slide and the several slides previous to this one, they're all monitoring policies and legislation either on the state or national level. There might be valuable opportunities to partner with them on particular legislative initiatives, depending on, what you're interested in and what's being considered in a given legislative session. Most important point here, get involved, be informed. Knowledge is power. How do these systems work? Where can we have the most hope of making an impact and influencing these public policy decisions to ensure that, they're removing barriers and increasing opportunities for people with disabilities? Get connected with your advocacy organizations, both on the state and national stage. And I love this quote by Gandhi, we have to be the change we want to see in the world. We can't do everything, in the words of Helen Keller, but there's still something we all can do. Not every one of us is going to be up in front of the podium. There are a lot of different roles people can play when we're working on these public policy campaigns. The most important thing is, unless we work together, we're not going to have the power to be able to make that change. Together, we can have a very powerful voice to let lawmakers know, policymakers, and state administrators and federal administrators, what needs to happen, and to ensure that our voices and our needs are being met. There's People First of New Hampshire here in the state. Able New Hampshire is the first state's disability justice organization. They just had their inaugural parade this past fall. They're definitely an organization to get connected with. And of course, the New Hampshire Council on Developmental Disabilities as well. There's GSIL, I think that was on one of the other slides. There are a lot of different organizations. With Google these days, you can just Google what you're looking for. And if you're on social media, I know like on Facebook, there are a number of different forums and groups specific to different types of disabilities that you might want to get connected with. New Hampshire Family Voices is another really valuable organization as well.
And just also from my perspective too, I was a transplant. I didn't know any of this. And then my son was diagnosed with a developmental disability, and I had to learn really quickly. I remember the first time that I went to his transition meeting from early supports and services to the school district when he was 3 years old. And I remember being in that initial meeting, and they handed me this booklet called the Lilac Book. And even though I had a background in, my bachelor's was in legal studies, I could barely read it. And all I could think of, if I'm having trouble reading this, how about others? And and what could I do? And from there, I became a volunteer PIC advocate. And like Jen was just saying, I got the bug and really dove in with legislative advocacy. And really, I will, I'm lucky that it became my career, but it wasn't my beginning career. And I was well into being an adult when I made this change. So it's never too late. It's never too early. You can always get involved.
And I will, as another final thought, share that not only were some of the races in the 2022 general election or midterm election incredibly close, some like the difference of 1 or 2 votes.
Yep.
That's 1 or 2 voters, right? Difference. Some of them were very competitive. And then legislative bills that go through, sometimes whether a bill passes or dies is a matter of just a few votes. Yep. You can't assume that your New Hampshire House members and that your senators know what they need to know in order to vote responsibly on that. In fact, There was one bill a number of years ago on the topic of accessory dwelling units. It was the ADU bill, which could have presents a creative housing solution for people with developmental disabilities or even aging granite staters that need to be close to family to have some assistance, but maybe they don't want to live totally on their own. Well, we were trying to pass a bill to make it required that homeowners could have an accessory dwelling unit on their home as long as they followed, the local building requirements and regulations and all of that. And there was one New Hampshire representative who had been contacted by her constituent, and she's like, I would have voted no on this. I really didn't know what to make of it or what to think about it. But because you reached out and you shared your story about you and your daughter's situation, I voted yes, even though I did have some concerns on it. So we really do have a unique opportunity to influence public policy making here in New Hampshire and beyond.
So just to wrap up, CSNI has one more educational event, which is next Tuesday from 6 to 8, which is the next step, the advocacy. We talked a lot about advocacy tonight, but next week we're going to have some opportunities to role play and learn a little bit more about how to go about it. So again, that's from 6 to 8. Registration is open. It is free.
I'm so glad Ellie's fired up. Did you see your comment in the chat?
I'm like, yeah.
Ellie, sign up for Policy Partners or the Leadership Series.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
So before we say goodbye, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
I'm an advocate. I do advocate for yourself with Plus Company, and I love it because I do that, and I do People's First and SALT. It's called.
Yep, that's fantastic, Scott.
Yeah, is it the self-advocacy leadership team through, I think the DD Council helps to support them?
Yeah.
Yes, that's excellent. Good for you, Scott. I'm looking forward to seeing you at some of those budget hearings this spring.
All right, so we will close it out. Thank you all so much for being here. I know it is difficult in December. And thank you, Kenda. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it, but we wanted to make sure that we had this opportunity before the legislative session starts in January. Again, do not hesitate to reach out to myself or to Jen or to any of the groups that we listed. They are more than willing to help you out. All right, thanks so much. Thanks, Jen. Bye, everybody.